Welcome back to another episode of Sega Genesis Platformers. I've put together about 20 games in this episode that I think are worth talking about. Some of these games I really found to be incredible, and some of them not so incredible. Like I said, 20 games, let's take a look. We're going to start our platforming adventure with Quackshot starring Donald Duck, released in late 1991 by Sega. It launched right on top of the disastrous Fantasia, but this internally developed game would fare far better. Created by many of the same talents involved with the Sega Genesis version of Castle of Illusion, this one brings back the incredible color, animation, and personality of that game. The gameplay even has a little more depth, allowing you the ability to travel between stages at will and set up drop-off points. Stage design sets puzzles and obstacles in place to encourage it all. It's graphically still beautiful today, with only some slightly floaty gameplay holding it back from legendary status. The game is also shockingly cheap, going complete for under $20. Quackshot wouldn't be Donald's only dedicated Genesis adventure, and in late 1995 he'd be featured in Donald in Maui Mallard. This one was developed by Disney Interactive Studios, and as you'd expect, the game is visually very impressive. The animation alone puts most 16-bit games to shame, capturing that Disney art style perfectly. It suffers from shoddy level design here and there, but is overall not a bad experience at all. It was only released in Europe and Brazil, making it a bit more expensive than it should be at around $40 or so. Disney would also bring its new cartoon series Gargoyles to the Genesis in mid-1995. This exclusive was love at first sight for me. It had animation from the gods, fast responsive gameplay, and a gothic theme that tied it all together. The stage design could be confusing at times, and the music was on the weaker side of good, but it's a game well worth playing today. Card-only auctions can go single-digit cheap, but the dreaded paper box makes the full package far, far more expensive. Disney software would keep on coming, and in mid-1994 the Genesis would get the Jungle Book. You can definitely tell the same devs worked on Aladdin for the Genesis, as this feels very similar in both animation and gameplay. The stage design reminds me of The Lion King, and can be hard to navigate at times. The soundtrack includes a number of Disney favorites from the movie, but it lacks an overall punch that fails to drive the gameplay in any meaningful way. It's not a poor game by any means, and the asking price of around $15 is well worth adding it to your collection. Disney wasn't the only company looking to put their characters on Sega platforms, and in mid-1992, Sega would publish the Warner Brothers property Taz-Mania. Although I appreciate the graphical presentation here, I am not a fan of the gameplay or the sound. The stage design is a death trap, and the gameplay feels imprecise to me, adding to the frustration. I know I'm in the minority here, as this game is fairly popular, and with its meager asking price of $10 to $15 complete, it's definitely worth trying. The popularity of the first game would lead Sega to do a sequel, called Escape from Mars starring Taz, released in mid-1994. I found this one more playable thanks to the lack of insta-deaths, but the stage design can still be infuriating, with loads of cheap hits and confusion in regards of where to go and what to do. The sound is still unpleasant, and the graphics weren't nearly as appealing 2 years later. Much like the first game, it was popular, and a really inexpensive one to collect, going complete for single digits at times. Deep in the Genesis lifecycle, Sega would publish Vector Man in late 1995. Designed with loads of software-enhanced special effects, this futuristic platformer was visually very impressive. It featured multi-jointed, incredibly well-animated sprites and impressive background layering. There were also stages that featured scaling and rotation effects, and the bosses were often large and imposing. The soundtrack was rather weak, however, and the stage design often left the player taking leaps of faith, as it wasn't always clear as to where to go. It played well enough though, and coupled with the impressive visuals, it would make for a very playable game. You'd think that time would have added some value to this technical marvel, but you'd be wrong, as a complete copy is well under $20. Wanting to keep the ball rolling with their new character, Sega would release Vector Man 2 in late 1996. Returning would be the great animation from the first, but this time, we'd get a smoother level progression and design, making this a more enjoyable experience for me. The enemies are more varied, and I especially like the focus on more organic designs. The music had a better effect on the atmosphere of the game as well, and there were varied gameplay segments that added some much needed variety. Much like the first one, this one is shockingly cheap, again often going for under $20 complete. Core Design would get in on the platformer craze in 1992 with the release of Chuck Rock. Normally a big fan of their work, I really dislike this one. While the game looked decent enough, I was not a fan of the sprawling level design, attack mechanics, and the irritating soundtrack. Only its meager asking price of sub $20 holds any merit at all. It's really funny, because I really enjoyed the sequel, Chuck Rock 2, Son of Chuck, released a year later in mid-1993, again developed by Core Design. This one righted most of the wrongs in the first game for me, with better gameplay, more precise attack mechanics, and far more pleasant music. There are also a number of nice special effects in the game that add to the appeal. A complete copy is often a bit more expensive than the first, but it's well worth it in my opinion. Sega would publish X-Men in early 1993, a Genesis exclusive. I really wanted to like this one, but found the gameplay, graphics, and sound to be quite a letdown. The game was brutally hard in places, with some of the bosses wrecking you in seconds. It wasn't broken or unplayable, however, and many gamers I know quite enjoyed it. The price is right too, easily had for under $20. The sequel would be released in mid-1995 by Sega, titled X-Men 2 Clone Wars. This was a full-on improvement in virtually every single way. The graphics are better and have more variety. The music and sound effects are better, and the gameplay tighter and more precise. It's still hard as hell though, and you'll need to put in some time to get anywhere, but this one is worth the effort. It's one of the best 2D X-Men action games ever made, and much like the first, its asking price is quite reasonable. Sega would internally develop eSWAT, an original game based loosely on the arcade game of the same name, and release it in mid-1990. Unlike the arcade game, which was more a run and gun, eSWAT on the Genesis was a pure action platformer. And if you know anything about my channel, it's also one of the best games on the system in my opinion. I adore this game for a number of reasons, starting with its visual and audio presentation. The graphics are well drawn with a great variety of enemies and bosses. It's one of my favorite soundtracks of any game on the system, and the voice work is as solid as any on the machine. Gameplay is straightforward but extremely well paced, and the stage design never has you guessing where to go or what to do. It's an absolute steal at its asking price of under $20 complete. I recommend it to every platforming fan that owns the machine. It's classic goodness and a great piece of the system's library.
Them the breaks.
A dark day would come in late 1992 when Sega would shame themselves and the brand by publishing Chakan the Forever Man. It's games like this that would hurt Sega's reputation with gamers after the Super Nintendo was released. This game point blank sucks. The gameplay is infuriating and exhausting all at once. You are supposed to be this badass with dual swords who was so awesome that Death himself couldn't defeat you. Yet every damn lizard and frog in this ass-backwards world has no problem whooping your ass. And they never stop coming. Every scroll of the screen, every jump, every platform, there is some pre-placed enemy waiting in just the right spot to hit you. Some enemies take multiple hits to dispatch in areas that make getting hit almost mandatory. Jumps don't feel precise at all, and why does a guy called the Forever Man die when falling into a hole? This one is nice and cheap at around $20, but I still don't recommend it. It's a bad playing game with terrible stage design that will leave you wanting to stomp the damn system after playing it. Sega wasn't done with poor games in late 1992, and we'd get another one with Green Dog, the beached surfer dude. I know this one has its fans, but I'm not one of them. The theme of the game didn't appeal to me at all, nor did the art design or the soundtrack. This left me with only the gameplay to entertain me, and unfortunately, I didn't care for that either. The jumps and attacks are precise enough once you get used to things, but there was just nothing going on that was worth slogging through this mess. There are stages that actually set you back at the beginning if you make mistakes, further adding to the desire to want to turn it off. For those of you liking the footage here or have fond memories of it, it can be had complete for well under $20 all day long. Mid-1991 would see Sega leverage another one of their comic book licenses by releasing Spider-Man vs. the Kingpin. There's not a lot special about this one. You crawl around a bit, punch a few enemies, and then fight bosses. The graphics are pretty average, the music doesn't drive the action, and the gameplay gets repetitive very fast. Nothing here is terrible though, and like many of the other games in this episode, it can often be gotten for well under $20. Sega would also publish another game based on a comic, with 1992's X-Mutants. There's nothing here that's gonna blow your mind, and the rather subdued objectives, stage designs, and enemies will turn off most in just a few minutes. Keep at it though, and you'll find a game that isn't bad at all, especially for the $10 it sometimes sells for.
Oh, God.
In the great toilet bowl of licensed games in the 16-bit era, you'd expect a game like McDonald's Treasureland Adventure to be among the worst, right? But wait, what's this? It's developed by famed Genesis programmers at Treasure, you say? Well, we certainly have to take a look then. Released in late 1993, this was a shock to me in virtually every single way. First, the game looks great, with awesome color, multi-layer backgrounds, and great-looking sprites. Even the music was good, reminding me of stuff from Final Fantasy and Phantasy Star. Surely the gameplay sucked then, right? Nope, even that was good, reminiscent of games like Dynamite Headdy. It wound up being a total package of goodness, and a great game to own. A Treasure-developed McDonald's game that didn't suck must surely cost $500 on the Genesis today. Not at all, and you can have this absolute gem for a mere $50 complete. I'd even go so far as to say it's a must-own. Namco would get in on the platforming goodness with a port of its arcade hit Marvel Land in mid-1991. Straightforward, fast, colorful, and challenging is what you need to know about this one. It's the type of game that most people would pass by if they just looked at the box, but there is actually a good game hidden away in its simple presentation. It's not arcade perfect, but it's fun, and that's all that matters. A complete copy tends to be expensive, at around $40 or so. Our last game for this piece needs little introduction. Whether you know it by Castlevania Bloodlines, Castlevania The New Generation, or Vampire Killer, it's the only original game in the series ever produced for a Sega console. It's also the system's best game in my opinion. Sporting a great throwback look to the NES games, this one is loaded with massive bosses, great special effects, and varied stages. Matching the visual splendor beat for beat is the glorious soundtrack, easily one of the best for the system. It's old and new all at once, capturing the feel of not only the series, but also of the environments you'll listen to them in. It's the kind of music that still plays in your head long after you've cut the machine off, sending you to your PC looking for the MP3s. The gameplay reaches back to the classic NES titles as well, setting you loose on mostly linear stages that are loaded with bosses, a massive variety of enemies to defeat, and even 2 different players with unique abilities to choose from. Few games of the era nailed so many things right at the same time. The entire package comes together in one exciting and challenging adventure that no Genesis or Mega Drive owner should miss. A complete and hardbox copy will cost you $100 or more, with the European variant going for a bit more. The Japanese Mega Drive version is rare as rocking horse shit, and you'll pay a good $300 plus to get it. While putting together this episode, I kind of realized just how many more platformers there are on the Genesis. How many platformers were exclusive to one region and not another. It really is mind-boggling how this genre just completely controlled that era of gaming. I have a lot more stuff to look at in this series. And guys, remember, these episodes are just done for the fun of it. They're just purely me throwing my opinions out there. You will not share some of those opinions, and for whatever reason that you may like something that I don't, hit me down in the comments and let me know why. I'm Sega Lord X. I really appreciate you guys watching. I'll catch you next time.